Michael, you've been writing about this pandemic and especially its origins. Your book, Snake Oil: How Xi Jinping Shut Down the World, was on my radar early. And I actually think it's a very, very important, let's call it a historical work at this point. Before we go there, I want to talk about your observations about what's happening at the World Health Assembly as we speak and them working on this so-called global pandemic treaty. I'm just going to read something you wrote in a recent piece you put out. Take heart. The pandemic treaty won't annul your national sovereignty. That would be impossible because you haven't had any national sovereignty since March of 2020. Okay, I'm not sure everyone would agree with you on this point. So why don't you tell me what's going on here?
Yeah, so right now, the World Health Organization in Geneva, Switzerland is debating amendments to the international health regulations. What it really does is, it expands the WHO's power, allocates them more resources, more funding, essentially more of what they've already been doing, all this testing and surveillance, all these, big data. Technically, these health regulations are not binding on member nations. They all can be overruled by the national sovereignty of a given country. However, there is serious concern about national sovereignty here because when countries sign up for this treaty, these amendments to the international health regulations, they are consenting and essentially implementing. Many countries just implement these, rubber stamp them for their own national territory with very little oversight of their own. And so even though these amendments, this treaty is not technically binding, it raises serious concerns about national sovereignty for countries all over the world because countries do follow this. And essentially, this is a ratification of everything that we saw with COVID-19. Now, going back, does anybody think that what the World Health Organization did during COVID-19 was a smashing success? I don't think so. What role did the World Health Organization play? First, they started out, as is widely known, by helping China cover up the virus. Next, they rubber stamped lockdowns into policy based on very little. Lockdown is not something that was in any country's pandemic plan. It was actually had no precedent in the Western world since the Middle Ages at the very latest. But based solely on what the Chinese Communist Party said had succeeded in Wuhan, this ridiculous narrative that the super lockdown in Wuhan had eliminated the virus from all of China. Just a few weeks after that, China comes and tells the entire world in no uncertain terms, the World Health Organization's representative of China gives a press conference and tells the entire world what China has shown the world is you have to do this. Copy China's response to COVID-19. And based solely on that, he tells the entire world, regardless of what their demographics are, their economics are, even their number of COVID-19 cases, tells them all they have to do this. And based on that, one by one, like dominoes, the entire world starts to shut down. That really accounts for everything we saw over the past 2 years, from the lockdowns to the mask mandates to the mass testing and vaccine passes, this entire terror campaign. The PCR testing guidance from the World Health Organization. They issued this guidance that was also unprecedented. Western pandemic plans to, start mass testing for COVID-19 with PCR tests. It turns out that the cycle thresholds that were issued along with that guidance, which also came from China, by the way. The New York Times later confirmed that was an 85 to 90% false positive rate. It's an unspeakable crime what's taken place over the last 2 years. And now you have all these nations going to Geneva, Switzerland. The World Health Organization is asking for more power to do the same thing, not just the same thing, but more of it. And all these countries are saying, okay, that's great. Everything we experienced was just fine and dandy. Let's do more of it. And that's the real significance here.
We live in an era of censorship and disinformation, and it can be really hard to know what's true and what's false in this information climate. To get honest information and insights you can trust, join us on Epoch TV. You can sign up for your 14-day free trial at ept.ms/freetrialjan. That's ept.ms/freetrialjan. We just had Dr. David Bell on the show, and he explained, the distinction between the international health regulations that are being looked at as we speak, and also this pandemic treaty that is being worked on that will be voted on, the following year. I just wanted to get you to clarify that because it almost sounded like the two are being kind of conflated into one in what you were saying.
The amendments to the international health regulations are more immediate. The pandemic treaty, which is also being debated and being talked about, will be something that's passed in the future, and that's something that has not been drafted yet in any serious way, but will give the World Health Organization again a whole host of new powers if nations decide to go down that path as well.
So how is it that this actually validates these lockdowns?
So the lockdown was not part of any country's pandemic plan, not part of any, had no precedent in history prior to the lockdown of Wuhan, China. However, after the Chinese Communist Party in February of 2020 announced that their lockdown of Wuhan was a smashing success, the World Health Organization rubber stamps that into policy. And the entire world follows that endorsement of the lockdown by the World Health Organization. It becomes part of their own policy. And this is something that they're actually working on. It's not even up for vote. It's not part of the amendments to the health regulations or the pandemic treaty, but they have simply adopted lockdown as policy.
But these are a legitimate way of responding when all the evidence shows otherwise.
That's exactly right. They are adding legitimacy to these policies by signing on to the treaty. When you look at every single policy that was implemented in response to COVID-19, you find China's paw prints on every single policy, because it all comes back to the central lie that the lockdown of Wuhan, the response of the Chinese Communist Party in Wuhan was so super effective that it eliminated the virus from all of China. This ridiculous narrative. And every single one of these policies comes back to what the Chinese Communist Party said they did in Wuhan. The mass testing, they said, that's what worked in Wuhan, using the cycle thresholds that worked in Wuhan, do it there. Lockdowns, mask mandates, obviously vaccine passports has the China's paw prints all over it. Every single one of these policies, it turns out, was just, kind of laundered into policy based on the fact that our officials and our elites were rubber stamping this lie that the Chinese Communist Party has succeeded in eliminating this virus. And of course, even if that wasn't obvious enough, I mean, you look at this graph, which I put in the cover of my book. This is, supposedly the COVID deaths in China until Xi Jinping gives the order, and suddenly there's flatline. I mean, that graph they didn't even do a good job forging it, but that has been the basis for the world's response to COVID-19. And even more vividly, we've seen in the last year, suddenly China is back in lockdown again. So everything that we've been told by this biosecurity community over the last 2 years that, copy China, copy all these policies, has been, belied by what just happened in China. Now all of a sudden they're back in lockdown again. They never actually eliminated the virus to begin with. It was just a really ridiculous data fraud that somehow got legitimized by the international influence, the global influence that the Chinese Communist Party has developed over several decades within elite media outlets, within universities, with politicians, with think tanks. You see all of them. The closer you get to the centers of power regarding the response to COVID-19, the more likely people are to repeat this lie that the Chinese Communist Party actually did eliminate this virus. And it's very, it's eerie to behold because everybody else can tell it's a obvious data fraud, but apparently, the elites in charge of the response cannot. That's what's accounted for everything that's happened.